She was kept off the stage because of the clothes she was wearing. Minutes later, a man brought everything to a halt and exposed the injustice in front of everyone. What seemed like a simple holiday pageant turned into a lesson no one would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. December had arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, bringing with it that humid heat characteristic of the southern states, but also an air of renewal that seemed to infect even the most hardened hearts. The downtown streets were adorned with twinkling lights, makeshift Christmas trees in the public squares, and the intermittent sound of holiday music spilling out of the shops. It was a time when even everyday problems seemed to take a break, as if the entire city had made a silent agreement to believe, if only for a few weeks, that better days were coming. In the north end of the city, where houses were packed tightly together and the uneven asphalt streets told stories of unfulfilled promises, Northwood Elementary School was experiencing its busiest days of the year. The institution, a two-story building with faded paint and bars on the windows, served about 300 children from the community. There, between cramped classrooms and a cracked concrete playground, dedicated teachers tried to work miracles with scarce resources, turning half-used pencils and old notebooks into tools for social transformation. That year, Principal Marilyn had decided to invest in the Christmas pageant like never before. It wasn't just an ordinary school performance. For these children, many of whom came from homes where Christmas meant just another day of struggle, getting up on that makeshift stage in the schoolyard represented being seen, being important, belonging to something bigger. Marilyn knew this. That's why she had mobilized the entire staff, secured donations for decent decorations, and even convinced Mrs. Helen Miller, known for her rigidity and perfectionism, to coordinate the children's choir. Helen Miller was 42 years old, her hair always pulled back in a flawless bun, and a posture that made it clear she tolerated no sloppiness. With 20 years of teaching under her belt, she carried a worldview shaped by years of frustration and unmet expectations. Teaching at this school was not what she had dreamed of as a young woman. In her early career plans, Helen had pictured herself at elite private schools, shaping future doctors and lawyers. But life had brought her here, and over time she had developed a defense mechanism that consisted of obsessively controlling everything within her reach. The pageant was her chance to show that even in a public school in a low-income neighborhood, it was possible to do something that looked at least minimally organized and presentable. For 3 weeks, Helen rehearsed the choir with almost military dedication. The children, initially excited, soon learned that singing under her supervision meant repeating the same songs dozens of times, maintaining perfect posture, even when their feet ached from standing so long, and above all, accepting constant criticism for every off-key note and every misplaced movement. Some parents began to complain about the excessive rigor, but Helen ignored them. She had a vision, and nothing would make her change her mind. Among the 30 children in the choir was Alice, a 5-year-old girl in her last year of kindergarten. Alice was one of those children who go unnoticed most of the time. Small for her age, with straight brown hair cut simply, she had large, expressive eyes that observed the world with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She spoke little, preferred to play alone in a corner of the playground during recess, and rarely caused any trouble. She was, for all intents and purposes, an invisible student. What no one at the school knew was that Alice was the daughter of Edward Morgan, one of the most successful businessmen in the region. Edward, at 45, commanded an empire that had started with a small food distribution company and had grown into a network that supplied supermarkets throughout the Carolinas. His name occasionally appeared in local newspapers, always associated with multi-million-dollar deals and business expansions. He was a discreet man who avoided the spotlight and preferred to keep his personal life out of the public eye. The decision to enroll Alice in that public school was deliberate and carefully considered. Edward had grown up poor in a small town in rural West Virginia. He intimately knew the smell of a leaky roof, the taste of food rationed to last the week, the feeling of wearing hand-me-downs from older cousins. When he finally achieved financial success in his 30s, he promised himself he would never forget where he came from. And when Alice was born, the result of a brief relationship that hadn't lasted, Edward decided that his daughter would grow up with her feet on the ground, understanding that privileges weren't guaranteed and that empathy is learned by living alongside different realities. But keeping Alice in public school without her true identity being revealed was a constant challenge. Edward had made an agreement with Principal Marilyn, who was the only person at the institution who knew who he really was. The girl's full name in the school records was just Alice Rogers Smith, using her mother's last name. Edward discreetly paid for some necessary repairs at the school, always anonymously, and in return, he only asked that they treat his daughter like any other child. No privileges, no special treatment. The person who took care of Alice day to day was Miss Lucy, a 58-year-old woman who had worked for Edward for over a decade. Lucy was a widow, a mother of 3 grown children, and she treated Alice with the affection of a grandmother. She was the one who dropped off and picked up the girl from school, prepared her meals, helped with her homework, and patiently listened to her childhood stories. For the past few days, Alice had talked about nothing but the pageant. The girl rehearsed the songs at home, singing softly in the shower or while playing with her dolls. For her, that event represented something grand, a chance to be part of something special. Miss Lucy noticed the different sparkle in Alice's eyes every time the girl mentioned the performance, and that worried her a little. Lucy knew Mrs. Miller well, having seen her a few times at the school gate. There was something about that woman that bothered her, a hardness in her eyes, a poorly disguised impatience with the children. But Lucy didn't mention anything to Edward. After all, he had entrusted his daughter's education to that school, and she didn't want to seem intrusive or create unnecessary problems. Edward, for his part, was completely absorbed in his work that December. The holiday season was the busiest time for his company, with supermarkets placing huge orders and tight delivery deadlines. He spent long hours at the office, came home late at night when Alice was already asleep, and left early in the morning before she woke up. They talked mostly by phone, quick calls where he would ask about her day, and Alice would respond with the natural enthusiasm of a 5-year-old. When Alice mentioned the pageant, Edward mentally noted the date. He wanted to be there. Despite his tight schedule, this was important to his daughter, and he wouldn't miss it for anything. But Edward had a dilemma. He knew his presence would attract attention. If he showed up at the school as the businessman Edward Morgan, there would be a commotion. People would treat him differently, and that could affect Alice in ways he preferred to avoid. The girl deserved to experience that moment like any other child, without the weight of her father's last name interfering with the experience. That's when he had an idea that at the time seemed perfect. Edward called Miss Lucy on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the pageant. "Lucy, I need your help with something," he said over the phone, his voice carrying an unusual tone of excitement. "Of course, Mr. Morgan. What do you need?" "It's about Alice's pageant. I want to be there, but I don't want to cause a stir. So I had an idea. Is the school going to have a Santa Claus at the performance?" Lucy thought for a moment. "I think so, sir. Principal Marilyn mentioned something about it last week." "Perfect. Then I'll dress up as Santa Claus. That way I can be there, be part of everything, without anyone knowing who I am. I'll just be another dad wanting to see his daughter sing." On the other end of the line, Lucy smiled. It was a good idea. Typical of Mr. Morgan, always thinking of ways to protect Alice while remaining present. She promised to help by getting information on how the school would organize the Santa Claus figure at the event. In the following days, Alice grew more and more excited. Miss Lucy helped the girl choose the outfit she would wear for the pageant. There wasn't much to choose from. Alice had few clothes, all simple, bought at popular department stores downtown. Edward insisted on this. He wanted his daughter to understand that ostentation wasn't necessary. But everything Alice owned was always clean and well cared for, thanks to Miss Lucy's efforts. The chosen outfit was a simple but pretty white knit dress and a pair of black patent leather shoes that Edward had bought months ago for a classmate's birthday party. Miss Lucy ironed the outfit with care, making sure there were no wrinkles. Alice tried everything on the night before, twirling in front of the mirror with a wide smile on her face. "I'm going to sing on stage, Miss Lucy," the girl said, her eyes shining. "I'm going to sing really loud so everyone can hear." "You will, sweetie." "You're going to be the prettiest one of all," Lucy replied, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and a hint of worry she couldn't explain. That night, Edward came home earlier than usual. He found Alice still awake, sitting in the living room watching cartoons. The girl ran to hug him when she saw him walk in. "Daddy, you're home early." Edward picked her up, feeling that light yet infinitely precious weight in his arms. "I am, Princess. I wasn't going to miss the chance to see you all excited about the pageant tomorrow." "You're going to be there, right, Daddy? You promised." "I will. You can be sure I'll be there watching you sing." What Edward didn't tell her was that he would be there in costume, hidden behind a white beard and a red suit. He wanted it to be a surprise, a fun reveal after the performance. He imagined Alice's face when she discovered that Santa Claus was actually her father. It would be a special moment, something she would remember forever. That night, after putting Alice to bed, Edward stayed up in the living room thinking about the next day. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Marilyn, the principal, letting her know about the Santa Claus costume. She replied quickly, saying he would be welcome and that the children would be thrilled. Everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place, but sometimes the best-laid plans encounter obstacles that no one can foresee. And at Northwood Elementary School, a teacher named Helen was, at that very moment, mentally reviewing every detail of the pageant, every child's position on stage, every song that would be sung. In her perfectionistic mind, everything had to be flawless. And flawless for Helen meant uniform, organized, aesthetically pleasing. There was no room for imperfections. There was no room for anything that deviated from the standard she herself had set. And when the next day dawned, when Alice arrived at school wearing that simple white knit dress, when Helen saw her among the other children, something was going to break. A collision of different worlds was about to happen, and the consequences of that clash would go far beyond what anyone could imagine. In that moment of apparent tranquility, the night deepened over Charlotte. The lights in the houses went out one by one. In Edward's house, Alice slept, hugging a teddy bear, dreaming of the moment she would step onto the stage. In Helen's house, the teacher reviewed her pageant checklist one last time, marking each item with a red pen. And in Ms. Lucy's house, the woman said a silent prayer, asking for everything to go well, without knowing exactly why she felt that unease in her chest. The dawn would bring answers, and it would forever change the lives of everyone involved in this story that was just beginning. Edward's journey to becoming the man he was had been neither simple nor linear. Born in Beckley, West Virginia, the son of a mechanic and a seamstress, he had grown up watching his parents work from sunup to sundown to support the family. There were 4 siblings, and Edward was the oldest. From an early age, he learned that if he wanted something different, he would have to go after it himself. At 15, he was already working part-time at a neighborhood grocery store, carrying boxes and stocking shelves. The money he earned helped at home and paid for his own school supplies. It was at the grocery store that Edward developed his first love for commerce. He observed how products were arranged, how customers made their choices, what sold best, and what sat on the shelves. He asked questions of the owner, a grumpy old man who nonetheless appreciated the boy's curiosity. He learned about profit margins, negotiating with suppliers, and the importance of knowing your customers. Those informal lessons were worth more than many courses he would later take. When he graduated from high school, Edward made a decision that shocked his family. Instead of trying for college, something his parents dreamed of but knew was almost financially impossible, he announced he was moving to Charlotte to work with an uncle who owned a small food distribution company. His mother cried, thinking she was losing her son. His father tried to dissuade him, saying he wouldn't get anywhere without a degree. But Edward was sure of what he wanted. In Charlotte, sleeping in a tiny room at the back of the distribution warehouse, Edward worked like never before. He woke up at 5 in the morning to load trucks, spent the day making deliveries, and at night he studied spreadsheets and sales reports. His uncle, impressed by his nephew's dedication, began to involve him more and more in the business's decisions. 3 years later, when his uncle decided to retire, he offered Edward the chance to take over the company. At 23, with a risky bank loan and a lot of courage, Edward bought the distribution company. The first few years were a pure struggle. There were months when he could barely pay his employees. Nights when he slept only 3 hours, tormented by debts and bills coming due. But he didn't give up. He gradually expanded his client base, invested in better logistics, and built solid relationships with suppliers. And slowly, very slowly, the business began to grow. By the time he turned 30, Edward was running a respectable operation. The original company had transformed into a network of 3 distribution centers that served the entire Carolinas region. He hired competent managers, modernized processes, and invested in technology. The money started coming in, first in modest amounts, then in volumes he himself had trouble believing. By 35, he was a millionaire. By 40, his companies were worth more than he had ever dreamed possible. But financial success brought loneliness. Edward had married at 26, a local girl from Charlotte, the daughter of merchants, but the marriage didn't last 5 years. He worked too much, was always traveling, always closing deals. By the time he realized it, his wife was already involved with another man. The divorce was painful but inevitable. After that, Edward had a few relationships, but none of them lasted. The women who were interested in him seemed more attracted to his bank account than to the person he actually was. It was at a charity event, years after the divorce, that he met Rebecca. She was a kindergarten teacher, a volunteer at a non-profit for underprivileged children. They talked all night about things that didn't involve money or business. Rebecca had no idea who Edward was, and that ignorance was refreshing. They got involved, an intense but brief relationship. Rebecca got pregnant. When she found out, she was terrified. She didn't feel ready to be a mother. Edward, initially surprised, quickly embraced the idea of fatherhood. He offered his full support, but Rebecca was clear. She didn't want a permanent relationship. She wanted to live her life, but she needed Edward to take responsibility for the child. And that's how Alice came into the world. Rebecca had the baby, spent the first few months caring for her, but gradually drifted away. Today she lived in New York City, worked at an elite private school, and saw Alice only twice a year for short formal visits. Edward never judged her for it. Everyone had their own path. He took on fatherhood with all the intensity he was capable of, even knowing that raising a child alone while running a business empire would be challenging. Ms. Lucy entered their lives when Alice was just 6 months old. Edward hired her initially as a nanny, but she quickly became much more than that. She was a confidant, an advisor, and the mother figure Alice needed. Lucy had her own story of pain. She had lost her husband in a workplace accident 15 years earlier, when her children were still young. She raised the 3 of them practically on her own, sewing and cleaning houses to pay the bills. When her children grew up and went their own ways, she found herself in an empty house with a deafening silence. Working for Edward, taking care of Alice, gave her a new purpose. That little girl with big eyes became the daughter she could spoil without guilt, love without fear of being too permissive. The decision to put Alice in public school was a source of heated debate between Edward and his family. His siblings, who now had comfortable lives thanks in part to his success, thought it was absurd. Why expose the girl to a reality she didn't need to experience? Why not enroll her in a top-tier private school, where she would have the best teachers, the best facilities? Edward listened to the criticism in silence and held his ground. He didn't want Alice to grow up in a bubble. He didn't want her to become one of those rich people who look down on the poor as if they were a different species. He wanted her to know from an early age that the real world was made of people like her classmates, people who fought every day for dignity, for respect, for opportunities. But there were moments when even Edward doubted his choice. When he saw the school's worn-out building, the overcrowded classrooms, the scarce resources. When Alice came home saying she didn't have class because the teacher was out, or that the water fountain had been broken for weeks. In those moments, Edward questioned whether he was being too idealistic, sacrificing his daughter's education for abstract principles. It was then that he got to know Principal Marilyn better. In a private meeting he himself requested, Edward opened up about his dilemmas. Marilyn, a woman in her early 50s who had dedicated her entire life to public education, listened to him patiently. When Edward finished, she said something he would never forget. "Mr. Morgan, this school isn't perfect. We don't have state-of-the-art computers. We don't have a big library. We don't have a covered gym. But you know what we do have? We have teachers who wake up every day and come here because they believe that education transforms lives. We have children who need to believe they are capable, that they deserve respect, that they have a future. And if people like you pull their children out of here, if everyone who can choose always chooses private, what's left for these kids? What's left for this school? The message that remains is that only those with no other choice study here, and that kills any chance of improvement. Marilyn's words struck a deep chord. Edward decided not only to keep Alice in the school, but also to start contributing more actively, always anonymously, to small improvements. A new water fountain here, school supplies there, a repair for the leaky roof. Marilyn managed these contributions discreetly, and gradually the school began to improve. Other parents started to notice and got involved too. The community grew stronger. And Alice, despite the structural limitations, was happy. She had friends, she liked her teachers, she was learning. She was treated like any other child, with no privileges or exaggerated expectations. Up to that point, Edward's plan seemed to be working perfectly. Alice was growing up with empathy, with her feet on the ground, without losing the natural innocence of childhood. But not everything at the school was harmonious. Helen Miller represented a problem that not even Marilyn knew exactly how to solve. The teacher was technically competent, had a good command of the subjects she taught, but there was something about her that created discomfort. An excessive rigidity, a lack of sensitivity in dealing with the realities of those children. Marilyn had already received subtle complaints from other parents, but nothing serious enough to justify more drastic action. Helen had never been aggressive or clearly abusive. She was just harsh, cold, overly demanding. What Marilyn didn't know, what no one really knew, was what was going on behind Helen's controlled facade. The teacher carried her own pains, her own frustrations. She had grown up in a middle-class family that had fallen on hard times when she was still young. Her father, a small business owner, had gone bankrupt. Her mother developed health problems that consumed what was left of the family's finances. Helen had to abandon her dream of studying at a prestigious public university and settled for a second-rate private college, which she managed to pay for by working during the day and studying at night. She graduated, passed the civil service exam, and ended up at that school in a low-income neighborhood. And with each passing day, she felt that life had cheated her. She saw colleagues who had been luckier, who had gotten better jobs, better schools. She felt she deserved more, that she was capable of more, but she was trapped, and over the years that prison had turned bitterness into a need for control. If she couldn't control the course of her own life, she would at least control everything within her reach at school. And the pageant was her masterpiece, her chance to prove that even there, in that place she secretly despised, it was possible to do something impeccable. That night before the pageant, Helen slept little. She stayed up late, mentally reviewing every detail. She had lists upon lists, the position of each child on stage, the sequence of songs, the timing of entrances and exits, everything calculated, everything perfect. In her mind, there was no room for the unexpected. Anything that deviated from the established standard would be seen as a threat to that perfection, and she would not allow threats. Not that night. Not in her moment to show what she was capable of. The clock ticked on. The early morning arrived, bringing with it that heavy silence that precedes decisive moments. In different houses across the city, people slept or tried to sleep, each carrying their own expectations for the day ahead. Edward, Alice, Lucy, Helen, Marilyn, lives that until then had followed parallel paths, about to intersect in a way that no one could have predicted. Sometimes destiny reveals itself slowly, other times it explodes all at once, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, the trivial into the memorable. And on the morning that was about to dawn, when the sun would once again light up the streets of Charlotte, it would be one of those explosive moments. It would be the beginning of a chain of events that would change not only those specific lives, but an entire community. It would be, though no one knew it yet, the beginning of a great transformation. The day dawned with a clear sky, that intense blue that only a December in the south can offer. The temperature was already rising quickly from the early morning hours, promising another hot and muggy day. In Charlotte, the city was slowly waking up, with the usual hustle and bustle of people heading to work, crowded buses and traffic starting to build on the main avenues. At Edward's house, Alice woke up earlier than usual, with an excitement she couldn't contain. She jumped out of bed and ran to her father's room, finding him still asleep. "Daddy, Daddy, wake up, today's the day of the pageant," she said, shaking his arm. Edward opened his eyes slowly, still drowsy, but smiled when he saw his daughter so animated. "I know, Princess. I'm waking up. Go tell Miss Lucy to make your breakfast." Miss Lucy had been up for a while. In fact, she had barely slept, consumed by that inexplicable unease that had been with her since the night before. She prepared breakfast with special care, making warm blueberry muffins, fresh squeezed orange juice, and sliced fruit. Alice ate quickly, talking non-stop about the song she would sing, about how nervous but excited she was, about how she thought everyone would love it. Edward had his coffee while watching his daughter, his heart tight with that immense protective love that only parents know. He knew that in a few hours he would be there, in the schoolyard, witnessing an important moment in Alice's life. And he would be in costume, hidden, watching everything without being recognized. The idea still seemed ingenious to him. After breakfast, Miss Lucy took Alice for her bath. She washed the girl's hair carefully, combed it with affection, and put in a little white bow that matched her dress perfectly. The outfit was impeccably ironed, hanging on a hanger since the day before. Alice got dressed with Lucy's help, looked at herself in the mirror, and twirled, pleased with what she saw. "Do I look pretty, Miss Lucy?" "Of course you do, sweetie. The prettiest of all." Edward appeared at the bedroom door, already dressed to leave. He had to go to the office for a few hours to handle some urgent matters, but he would be back in time to get into his costume and go to the school. He knelt down to Alice's level, adjusting the bow in her hair. "You look beautiful, my princess. I'll see you at school in a little while, okay? You promise you'll be there, Daddy?" "I promise, and I never break my promises." When Edward left, Alice counted the minutes until it was time to go to school. The pageant was scheduled to start at 3 in the afternoon, but the children had to arrive early for final preparations. Miss Lucy had arranged to take Alice around 2 o'clock. The car ride was short, about 15 minutes, but she preferred to leave early to avoid any unforeseen delays. Meanwhile, at the school, Helen had arrived even earlier than usual. By 10 in the morning, she was already there, checking every detail of the decorations, testing the sound system, making sure the chairs for the guests were all perfectly aligned. A few staff members were helping her, but she corrected anything that wasn't exactly as she wanted it. "A little more to the right. No, that banner is crooked. This microphone needs to be higher." She was relentless. Marilyn, the principal, walked through the schoolyard around noon and found Helen measuring the distance between the rows of chairs with a tape measure. "Helen, don't you think you're overdoing it a bit? It's a school performance, not a show at Carnegie Hall," Marilyn said, trying to sound playful but with a real hint of concern. Helen didn't even look up from the tape measure. "Principal, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. I don't accept sloppiness. People will see that even here, at this school, we are capable of producing something of quality." Marilyn sighed. She knew that tone, that rigid posture. There was no point in arguing. She left Helen to her measurements and went back to her office, where she had piles of paperwork to sign. But she was left with that uneasy feeling in her chest, an inner voice telling her that something wasn't right. She tried to ignore it. After all, what could go wrong at a simple Christmas pageant? At 2 in the afternoon, the first parents began to arrive. The schoolyard gradually filled up, an excited buzz taking over the atmosphere. Chairs were being occupied. Children were running around in their regular clothes, waiting for the moment to put on their choir outfits. The decorations, she had to admit, were truly beautiful. Helen had managed to transform that simple yard into a festive setting, with golden stars hanging from the ceiling, an imposing Christmas tree in one corner, and twinkling lights wrapped around the window bars. It was at that moment that Miss Lucy arrived with Alice. The girl held her nanny's hand tightly, her eyes wide as she took in all the activity. Lucy led her to where the other choir children were gathering, near the makeshift stage. Alice joined her classmates, receiving greetings from a few teachers who passed by. Everything seemed to be going well. Helen appeared minutes later, carrying a clipboard and taking attendance. She checked off name after name, making sure everyone had arrived. When she got to Alice, she stopped. She looked the girl up and down, that analytical, cold gaze that made some children shrink. Alice smiled, expecting a compliment, a greeting, but what came was very different. "Is that the dress you're planning to wear for the performance?" Helen asked, her tone already laced with disapproval. Alice, not understanding the gravity of the question, nodded yes, still smiling. Helen frowned. "No, that won't do. The outfit is completely outside the standard. Look at the other girls. See how uniform they are." Alice looked around. The other girls in the choir were wearing similar dresses, mostly white or in pastel shades, but there was a variety of styles. Some were more elaborate, with ruffles and details, others simpler like hers. Alice didn't see a significant difference, but Helen did. To her, Alice's dress was too simple, without sparkle, without flair. It clashed with the image she wanted to project. "But Mom, I rehearsed everything perfectly. I know all the songs," Alice said, her voice beginning to tremble. Helen showed no empathy. "It's not about knowing the songs. It's about visual presentation. We have a standard to maintain here, and you, as you are not suitable. Go sit over there and watch the rehearsal. When it's time for the performance, you'll stay out." The words fell on Alice like heavy stones. The girl tried to argue, tried to say she had worked so hard, that she wanted to sing so badly, but her voice got stuck in her throat. Tears began to well up, hot and inevitable. Helen, impassive, pointed to a chair at the back of the yard. "Go sit there and be quiet. I don't want any drama." And she pointed to another child, continuing with the roll call as if nothing serious had just happened. Alice walked to the indicated chair, each step heavy, her vision blurred by the tears she was trying to hold back. She sat down, small and hunched over, hugging herself. Around her, other children and a few parents who had witnessed the scene exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. No one questioned it. Mrs. Helen Miller's authority was too intimidating for anyone to dare confront her openly. Miss Lucy, who had gone to get a cup of water, returned minutes later and was surprised not to see Alice with the other children. She scanned the area and finally found her sitting alone at the back, crying softly. Lucy's heart ached. She walked quickly to the girl. "Alice, what happened? Why aren't you with the others?" Alice, between sobs, told her what the teacher had said. "Mrs. Miller said my dress isn't good enough, that I can't sing." Lucy felt indignation rise in her throat. She looked at Helen, who was on the other side of the yard organizing the children. She thought about going over, about questioning that absurd decision. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the fear of making things worse for Alice. Maybe it was the awareness of her social standing, a nanny in a school where she was neither a mother nor an official relative. She felt powerless. "Stay calm, sweetie. Your dad will be here soon. We'll sort this out," Lucy said, trying to comfort Alice while she seethed with anger inside. She took out her phone and sent an urgent text to Edward. "We need to talk. It's about Alice, the pageant. Something serious has happened." Edward was, at that very moment, walking into the costume shop where he had rented the Santa Claus outfit. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but his hands were full carrying the bag with the costume. He only saw Lucy's message when he was already in the car, on his way to the school. He read the words, his heart racing. He tried to call her, but the call wouldn't go through. The network was spotty, a common issue in that neighborhood. He sped up, his worry growing. Back at the school, the pageant was about to begin. The parents filled all the available chairs, with some standing on the sides. There was an atmosphere of anticipation in the air, that restless silence that precedes school performances. The choir children were lined up on the stage, 30 nervous and excited little singers. 30, except for Alice, who remained seated at the back, invisible to most of the audience. That's when Edward arrived. He entered through a side door of the schoolyard, already fully in costume. A thick white beard covered half his face, a long white wig, round glasses, and a full red suit with black boots. He was, for all intents and purposes, unrecognizable. Some parents smiled when they saw him, thinking it was a nice surprise from the school. Younger children pointed excitedly, whispering, "Is that the real Santa Claus?" Edward began to walk around the yard, waving and smiling, discreetly looking for Alice. He expected to see her on stage with the other children, but she wasn't there. He frowned, confused. He kept searching with his eyes until he finally spotted her, alone, at the back, with her head down and her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat that squeezed his heart like a vice. Edward walked over to her, crouching in front of the chair where Alice was sitting. "Hi there, little one. Why aren't you up there with the others?" he said, disguising his voice so she wouldn't recognize him immediately. Alice looked up, her eyes red from crying. "The teacher said my dress isn't pretty, that I can't sing." The words hit Edward like punches to the gut. He felt anger rise, hot and uncontrollable, but he forced himself to stay calm, at least for now. "Your dress is beautiful. Who was this teacher who said that?" Alice pointed to Helen, who was on stage, at that moment adjusting a microphone. Edward looked at the teacher, memorizing her face. "Stay here for a little bit, okay? Santa Claus is going to take care of this." He stood up, his mind already made up. No costume would hide his outrage. No social consideration would stop him from doing what was right. His daughter had been publicly humiliated, excluded for an absurd and cruel reason, and that would not stand. The performance began. The opening notes of a Christmas carol echoed through the yard. The children started to sing, their young voices blending into a choir that was, he had to admit, truly harmonious. Helen conducted from the side of the stage, pleased with herself, believing she had done everything right. The parents applauded, recorded videos on their phones, and smiled proudly. Everything seemed perfect. But perfection is a fragile thing, built on foundations that can crumble with a single act of courage, and Edward was about to perform that act. He walked to the side of the stage, his firm steps drawing the attention of a few people. Some thought it was part of the show that Santa Claus was going to hand out gifts between songs, but there was something in his posture, a determination that didn't match the expected joy of the Christmas character. Edward stepped onto the stage. The children continued to sing, but some began to look away, curious about this red figure who now occupied the center of the space. Helen noticed the movement and frowned. What did that man think he was doing? This wasn't in the script. She started walking towards him, ready to politely ask him to leave the stage. But before she could speak, Edward went to the sound technician and asked for the microphone. The man, confused, looked at Helen for confirmation. Edward didn't wait. He took the microphone from his hand and turned it on. The sound of the pageant faded, the children stopping their singing one by one, not understanding what was happening. Silence fell over the yard. All eyes were now on the unexpected Santa Claus. "Good afternoon, everyone," Edward began, his voice firm and clear through the speakers. "I'm sorry to interrupt this beautiful performance, but I need to talk about something important. Something that happened here today and cannot be overlooked." Helen tried to intervene, approaching him. "Sir, you're not authorized to..." But Edward cut her off with a wave of his hand. The teacher stopped, something in his eyes behind the costume making her hesitate. "Today is a day of celebration," Edward continued. "A day when these children, who worked so hard rehearsing for weeks, would have the chance to shine, to feel special, to show their parents and guardians what they are capable of. But one of those children is not here on this stage. She is over there, at the back." He pointed to where Alice was sitting, and hundreds of eyes turned in that direction. Alice shrank, even further into her chair, not understanding what was happening. Lucy, who was beside her, held her hand. "And why isn't this little girl here singing with her classmates?" Edward asked, his voice now thick with barely contained emotion. "Because someone who should be looking out for the well-being of all these children decided that her dress was not adequate, decided that she did not meet the established aesthetic standard, decided that appearance is more important than dedication, than effort, than a child's right to participate." Murmurs began to spread through the crowd. Some parents looked at each other, shocked. Others looked at Helen, who was now pale, realizing the situation was spiraling completely out of her control. "This little girl," Edward said, his voice trembling, is my daughter, and for weeks I listened to her rehearse the songs for this pageant. I saw the excitement in her eyes every night when she talked about today. I saw how she prepared with so much care, choosing the best dress she has, combing her hair, dreaming of this moment. The yard was absolutely silent now. Even the sound of traffic outside seemed to have vanished. Edward began to remove the fake beard, slowly revealing his face. When the beard was completely off, he also took off the red hat and the wig. Some parents immediately recognized that face. Edward Morgan, the businessman. The whispers intensified. Helen felt her legs go weak. Her brain was trying to process what was happening. That man was Alice's father? The girl she thought came from a poor family, whose exclusion she had justified based on that very assumption. And worse, he was Edward Morgan. I put my daughter in this school for a reason, Edward continued, no longer hiding the emotion in his voice. I wanted her to grow up understanding that all people have value, regardless of how much money they have or what clothes they wear. I wanted her to learn empathy, respect, humanity. But what did she learn here today? She learned that she is judged by her appearance. She learned that it doesn't matter how hard you try. If your dress isn't considered good enough, you are not welcome. If you were in Alice's shoes, would you have accepted this injustice or fought for your rights? Let us know in the comments. Marilyn, the principal, who was standing at the side of the yard, felt her blood run cold. She knew nothing about this. She hadn't been consulted about Alice's exclusion. Helen had made that decision on her own, and now, in front of everyone, the school was being exposed for a serious failure. She started walking towards the stage, but Edward kept talking. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, he said, looking around the yard, making eye contact with several parents. I'm here because I believe that all of us, as adults, have a responsibility to protect our children, to ensure that they are treated with dignity and respect. And when that doesn't happen, we need to have the courage to speak up, to question, to demand change. He turned to Helen, who was now practically frozen. Ma'am, you may have your reasons, you may have your justifications, but I'll tell you one thing. No reason, no justification in the world is enough to humiliate a child, to make her feel that she is not good enough, to steal from her a moment that should have been one of joy and turn it into pain. Helen tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her reasoning about maintaining visual harmony, about standards and organization. But suddenly, all those justifications sounded hollow, petty, cruel. Edward stepped down from the stage and walked to where Alice was. The girl looked up at him, her eyes still wet. Daddy? Was that you, Santa Claus? Edward smiled, though his own eyes were moist. It was, my princess, and now I'm going to take you to the place where you should have been all along. He took her by the hand and started walking with her back to the stage. Marilyn rushed. To intercept them, not to stop them, but to support them. Mr. Morgan, I had no idea. Please believe me. Alice, my love, of course you're going to sing. Come on, let's get you up there with the others. She looked at Helen with a hardness the teacher had never seen before. We will talk later. In my office now. The other children in the choir, who had been paralyzed, not knowing how to react, began to move. Some of Alice's classmates called out to her, making space for her among them. Come on, Alice, come sing with us. The girl looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. Go on, princess, it's your moment. Alice climbed back onto the stage, this time not as an outcast, but as the protagonist of that dramatic turnaround. She took her place among her classmates, who welcomed her with smiles. The sound technician restarted the music. The children began to sing again, but now with a completely different emotional charge. Many parents in the audience were crying. Some were recording the moment, knowing they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple school performance. Alice's voice, small at first, grew stronger. She sang looking at her father, who was now at the side of the stage recording everything on his phone, his face streaked with tears of pride and emotion. Edward realized it wasn't just about the pageant. It was about justice, about dignity, about teaching Alice that she had value, that she deserved respect, that no one had the right to make her feel less than she was. When the song ended, The applause that echoed through the yard was deafening. People rose to their feet, a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. They were applauding the children, but they were also applauding a father's courage, the breaking of a complicit silence, the denouncement of an injustice. Helen, in the corner of the stage, watched it all like a statue. She knew her life would never be the same after that day, that this would have consequences, and for the first time in a long time, she was forced to look inward, to question the choices she had made, the values she had embraced, the person she had become. The pageant continued. Other songs were sung, but nothing overshadowed what had happened. That moment would be etched in the memory of everyone present, and in the days that followed, as the story spread, as parents began to share the video that many had recorded, as local newspapers picked up the case, the ripples of that event would begin to expand in ways no one there could have predicted. What seemed like an end was, in fact, just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The pageant ended shortly after 5 in the afternoon, as the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the Charlotte sky in shades of orange. The parents gradually left, taking their children with them, but the murmurs about what had happened continued to echo through the hallways and in the makeshift parking lot in front of the school. Groups formed, people exchanging impressions, opinions, and video recordings that were already starting to circulate through the community's parent group chats. Edward remained at the school even after most people had gone. Alice was with Miss Lucy in the yard, eating a piece of cake that one of the cafeteria ladies had brought especially for her. The girl was calmer now, the trauma from earlier in the afternoon slowly being replaced by the joy of having finally sung, of having been seen and valued. But Edward knew that the conversation he needed to have with Principal Marilyn couldn't wait. He found Marilyn in her office, sitting behind her desk with her head in her hands. When Edward knocked on the already open door, she looked up and he could see she had been crying. "Mr. Morgan, please come in, I need to speak with you." Her voice was heavy with emotion and exhaustion. Edward entered and closed the door behind him. He sat in the chair across from her desk, still wearing the bottom half of his Santa Claus costume, creating an almost surreal image. "Marilyn, what happened today wasn't your fault. You didn't know." Marilyn shook her head. "But I should have known. I'm the principal of this school. Everything that happens here is my responsibility. How did I let something like this happen? How did I not see that Helen was making decisions that were so cruel?" Edward sighed. "Helen, where is she now?" "She left right after the performance ended. Walked out without a word to anyone. I tried to stop her, but she just walked right past me." Marilyn wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Mr. Morgan, I don't know what to say. My first instinct is to fire her immediately, but HR procedures aren't that simple. She's a tenured employee. The most I can do right now is place her on temporary leave and open an administrative investigation." Edward was silent for a moment, processing. "I didn't come here to ask for anyone's head, Marilyn. I came because I want to understand. I want to know how we prevent this from happening again, not just to my daughter, but to any child in this school." Marilyn looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You're a rare person, you know that? Most parents in your position would use their money, their power, to destroy the person who hurt their child. But you're here talking about prevention, about systemic change." "Destroying Helen won't change anything," Edward replied. "She's just a symptom of a larger problem. How many other Helens are out there? How many teachers, principals, staff members judge children by their appearance, by their social background? We need to work on the root of the problem, not just trim the diseased leaves." The two talked for over an hour. Marilyn told him about Helen's history, about the frustrations she knew of, about how the teacher had always been difficult, but had never crossed such a serious line before. Edward shared his vision for education, about how growing up poor had taught him that dignity has no price, that respect can't be bought. They talked about creating protocols, about sensitivity training for all staff, about opening channels for parents to report problems without fear of retaliation. When they finally left the office, it was almost 7 in the evening. Alice was asleep in Miss Lucy's lap, emotionally exhausted from the intense day. Edward carefully picked her up in his arms so as not to wake her, feeling the small, precious weight of his daughter against his chest. "Let's go home, Miss Lucy. It's been a long day for all of us." On the drive home, Edward looked out the window at the illuminated city streets, his mind still processing everything. He knew what he had done would have repercussions. He could already imagine the headlines in the local papers, the comments on social media, the divided opinions. Some people would support him, call him a hero. Others would say he overreacted, that he publicly humiliated a teacher, that he used his power to get what he wanted. But Edward had no regrets. He would do it all again if he had to. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Helen arrived at her small, quiet apartment. She had lived alone for years. Ever since a brief, unsuccessful marriage had ended, she had no children, no pets. Loneliness was her constant companion, something she had learned to endure by building ever higher emotional walls. But that night, the walls were crumbling. Helen sat on her living room sofa and finally allowed the tears to come. She cried for hours, a deep sob that came from a place she had kept locked away for a long time. She cried for the public humiliation she had suffered, yes, but also for something deeper. She cried for the person she had become. For the harsh, insensitive teacher who had once been an idealistic young woman dreaming of transforming lives through education. When exactly had she lost her way? When had bitterness replaced compassion? Helen tried to remember. Perhaps it had been gradual, a series of small disappointments that slowly hardened her heart. The educational system that frustrated her, the students who didn't meet her expectations, the colleagues she judged as mediocre, the parents who questioned her methods. She had built an armor of rigidity and control as a defense against a world she felt was hostile, and in the process, she had lost sight of what truly mattered: the children. Alice, the little girl with big eyes and a simple dress. Helen tried to remember if she had ever truly looked at that child, if she had seen beyond the clothes, beyond the appearance, and she had to admit with a searing pain in her chest that she hadn't. She had looked at Alice and seen only an aesthetic problem to be solved. She hadn't seen a child with dreams, with feelings, with intrinsic worth. She had treated Alice like an object, not a human being. And the worst part was that Alice hadn't been the first. Helen began to recall other incidents over the years, other children she had been too hard on, whom she had rejected in subtle or explicit ways. How many other Alices had she created? How many other children had left her classes feeling inadequate, unseen, devalued? The count was impossible, but the weight was crushing. That night Helen made a decision. She would not go back to the school. She would request a transfer, take early retirement, anything. She could no longer face those children, those parents, those colleagues. The shame was too great. But more than that, she realized she no longer had the right to be in a classroom. She had lost the essence of what it means to be an educator, and regaining that, if it was even possible, would require a deep internal work she wasn't sure she had the courage to do. The following days were turbulent. The story spread through the city like wildfire. The video of the moment Edward interrupted the pageant went viral locally, shared thousands of times. Newspapers published articles, some balanced, others sensationalist. Edward Morgan defends daughter at public school. Businessman denounces prejudice at school pageant. Teacher excludes child over simple dress. The headlines varied, but they all told the same central story. Northwood Elementary School found itself at the center of a media storm. Marilyn spent days giving interviews, explaining that Helen's decision was an individual one, that the school did not condone that kind of behavior, that measures were being taken. The Department of Education opened an inquiry. The teachers' union issued a statement, torn between defending a colleague and acknowledging that what she had done was indefensible. Among the parents, reactions were mixed. Many supported Edward, some even coming to him personally to thank him for having the courage to expose a problem that many knew about but no one reported. Others, however, criticized his methods. They accused him of using his position as a wealthy businessman to publicly humiliate a teacher, of breaking school protocol, of turning a situation that could have been resolved discreetly into a spectacle. Edward read the comments on social media, listened to the opinions, but stood firm. He gave several interviews explaining his perspective. "I didn't do that because I'm rich," he would say. "I did it because it was right." Any parent, rich or poor, would have the right and the duty to defend their child in that situation. The problem is that many poor parents don't have a voice. They're intimidated by the system, by the fear of retaliation, by a sense of powerlessness. I have a platform, I have resources, so I use that not just for my daughter, but for all the children who go through similar situations and have no one to speak for them. Edward's words resonated with many people. In the following days, Marilyn began to receive reports from other parents about similar situations that had occurred over the years. Nothing as severe as Alice's case, but small discriminations, subtle comments, different treatment based on appearance or social background. One father told her his son had been prevented from participating in a field trip because he didn't have money for the voluntary contribution. A mother reported that her daughter was always placed at the back of the class because she wore old mended glasses. Another father mentioned that the gym teacher only picked kids for the teams who had expensive sports uniforms. Each report was a stab to Marilyn's heart. She had always believed her school was different, that despite the structural difficulties, there was a genuine commitment to all children. But she was beginning to realize there were systemic problems she had ignored for too long. Problems that only came to light when someone had the courage to speak loud enough to be heard. Edward, for his part, was changing, too. In the days after the pageant, he spent more time with Alice than he had in months. He cancelled meetings, delegated tasks, and prioritized being present. He had long conversations with his daughter, explaining in simple language why he did what he did, making sure she understood that she had done nothing wrong, that her dress was beautiful, that she had value regardless of what anyone said. Alice, slowly, began to process what had happened. She asked questions about Mrs. Miller, about why she had been so mean. Edward tried to explain without demonizing the teacher, without planting seeds of hatred in his daughter's heart. Sometimes, my princess, people do bad things not because they are bad, but because they are hurting inside. Mrs. Miller made a mistake, a big mistake, but she is also a person who needs help to heal. A week after the pageant, on a Thursday afternoon, Edward received a call from Marilyn. "Mr. Morgan, I need to speak with you. Can you come to the school? There's something you need to see." Her voice had a different tone, lighter, almost hopeful. Edward agreed and went there late that afternoon. When he arrived, Marilyn led him to a meeting room where about 20 parents were gathered. Edward recognized some faces, parents who had been at the pageant. Marilyn asked everyone to sit down. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "after what happened, many parents came to me wanting to do something, wanting to help change the school, and I realized that maybe this is the moment. Maybe what happened to Alice, as painful as it was, can be turned into something positive." She explained that the parents had decided to form an association, something the school had never had, an organized group that could work with the administration to improve the school, not just structurally, but also by creating clear codes of conduct, regular training for teachers, and effective communication channels between families and the school. "We want to ensure that no child goes through what Alice went through, and we want this school to be an example, not an exception." Edward listened, moved. This was more than he had hoped for. It was the systemic transformation he had mentioned to Marilyn days before. It wasn't just about punishing Helen or fixing a one-time problem. It was about rethinking the entire culture of the school. He looked at those parents, mostly simple, hard-working people from difficult backgrounds, who were there willing to dedicate their time and energy to improve their children's education. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. True hope. "Count on me," Edward said, "for whatever you need. And I'm not just talking about money, although I can help with that too. I'm talking about time, presence, commitment. Let's make this something that really works." That night, when Edward got home, Alice was already asleep. He went into her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and just stayed there, for long minutes watching his daughter. Alice slept peacefully, her hair spread out on the pillow, a small smile on her face. Edward thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the pain, the anger, the injustice. But he also thought about the change, the mobilization, the possibilities that were beginning to open up. and he realized that sometimes something has to break so it can be rebuilt, better and stronger. In the days that followed, the formation of the Parent Association gained momentum. The first official meeting took place on a Saturday morning in the covered court of a nearby church, provided for free by the pastor, who was also moved by the story. More than 50 parents showed up, a number that surprised even Marilyn. There were familiar faces and many new ones, people who had never actively participated in their children's school life, but now felt they had a voice, that they could make a difference. The meeting started tentatively. Many parents didn't know how to act, how to speak up. They were used to being passive recipients of information from the school, not active agents of change. But gradually, with Marilyn's careful mediation and the support of Edward, who deliberately positioned himself as just another parent, people began to open up. They started sharing experiences, telling stories, proposing ideas. One of the first concrete proposals came from Gerald, a bus driver and father of twin girls in the 3rd grade. He suggested creating a clear code of conduct, a document that would establish the rights and responsibilities of teachers, staff, parents, and students, something everyone could refer to that would explicitly state what was acceptable and what was not at the school. "We need written rules," he said, his voice rough but firm. "It can't just depend on each person's goodwill. It has to be on paper, in black and white." The idea was met with enthusiasm. Other parents added to it, suggesting that the code be developed collectively with participation from the entire school community. Ms. Brenda, a cook who had a son with a disability at the school, timidly raised her hand. "I'd also like to suggest that we talk about inclusion in this code. My junior, he's special, you know, and sometimes I see him being treated differently, not with malice, but with that pity that also hurts, as if he's less capable. I think we need to learn to treat all differences with respect, not just those of clothes or money." Ms. Brenda's words deeply touched those present. Marilyn took notes, realizing she was witnessing something much bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just about correcting a specific mistake. It was about rethinking the entire culture of the school, about creating an environment where every child, regardless of their particularities, felt valued and included. Edward listened to everything in silence, moved to see these people, many with little formal education but immense life wisdom, mobilizing with such dedication. When they asked him to speak, he chose his words carefully. "I thank all of you for being here, for showing that change is possible when we unite. I want to make one thing clear. I don't own this initiative. I'm not the leader of anything. I'm just another father who wants the best for his daughter and for all the other children in this school. So let's build this together, truly, without hierarchies, without privileges. Everyone's voice here has the same value." Edward's words were applauded, and there on that sunny morning in a borrowed church court, something began to form that would not only change Northwood Elementary School, but would become a model for other schools in the region. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Helen was living through her darkest days. The official leave came 3 days after the pageant, delivered by an employee from the Department of Education, who barely looked her in the eye as he handed her the document. Helen read the technical terms, the bureaucratic justifications, but none of it mattered. She already knew her career, at least as she knew it was over. She spent the first few days locked in her house, ignoring calls and messages. Her few teacher friends tried to get in touch, some in solidarity, others out of morbid curiosity. Helen didn't answer anyone. She was immersed in a painful internal process, confronting versions of herself she had preferred not to see for years. It was Irene, a retired teacher, who had been Helen's mentor in her early career, who finally broke through the isolation. She simply showed up at the apartment door on a Tuesday morning, ringing the bell insistently until Helen answered. When the door opened, Irene didn't ask for permission. She just walked in, went to the kitchen, and started making coffee as if she owned the place. "You're going to tell me what happened," Irene said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I don't want the version that's in the newspapers. I want your version, the real one." Sitting at the kitchen table between cups of coffee and shed tears, Helen finally opened up. She told her about the pressure she put on herself to make everything perfect, about how that pressure had turned into rigidity, about how she had gradually lost the ability to see the children as individuals, and began to see them as pieces in a puzzle she needed to arrange. She told her about the frustration accumulated over the years, about feeling trapped in a career that wasn't what she had dreamed of, about how that frustration had poisoned her way of relating to the world. "I became the teacher I myself would have hated as a young woman," Helen said, her voice choked with emotion. "I became exactly the kind of educator I swore I would never be. And I didn't even realize when it happened. It was gradual, you know? One day you're idealizing transforming lives, and the next, you're excluding a 5-year-old child because of her dress. How did I get to this point?" Irene held Helen's hand across the table. "You got here because you're human, because life hurt you, and you didn't know how to process that pain in a healthy way. But you know what sets you apart from many people? You're facing it, you're looking in the mirror, even though it's painful. And that's already a first step." The two talked for hours. Irene, with the wisdom of someone who had dedicated 40 years to education and had seen it all, didn't judge. But she didn't sugarcoat it either. "You hurt a child, Helen, and it wasn't the first time. You need to deal with that, make peace with it. Maybe you'll never be able to completely forgive yourself, but you have to try. And you need to decide, are you going to let this mistake define you forever, or are you going to use it as a turning point to become someone better?" Helen didn't have the answers at that moment, but Irene's words planted a seed. In the following days, she started doing something she had avoided for a long time, seeking professional help. She scheduled an appointment with a psychologist, started attending a support group for people dealing with professional burnout. It was painful, confrontational, but also necessary. Back at the school, changes were happening quickly. The code of conduct began to be drafted in weekly meetings that involved not only parents but also teachers, staff, and even representatives of the older students. Each item was debated exhaustively, with contributions from all sides. The document grew, was refined, and became something robust and significant. In parallel, Edward funded, discreetly through his company, a series of workshops on inclusive education, nonviolent communication, and humanized classroom management. He brought in experts from out of state, offering the training for free not only to Northwood Elementary, but to all public schools in the region. The response was surprising. Teachers who were initially skeptical began to engage, to realize that this wasn't just another bureaucratic imposition, but real tools to deal with the daily challenges of the classroom. One of the teachers who got most involved was Carla, Helen's colleague. Carla had always had her own insecurities, her own moments of being overly harsh with students, but what happened with Helen had shaken her deeply. She realized she was closer to that precipice than she wanted to admit. She participated in all the workshops, began to review her practices, to talk more openly with her students, to seek to understand each one's context before judging their behavior. And the results began to show. Children who were previously labeled as problematic began to flourish when treated with more empathy. Parents who once felt intimidated by the school began to get closer, to participate, to collaborate. The very atmosphere of Northwood Elementary changed. There was something different in the air, a lighter, more welcoming energy. Alice, who, in the first days after the pageant was still processing the trauma, slowly began to regain her natural joy. Edward noticed when she started playing more on the playground during recess, when her laughter once again echoed through the house. The girl hadn't forgotten what had happened, but she was learning with the help of her father and Ms. Lucy that one bad experience doesn't define who you are, that it's possible to heal, to move on, and even to turn pain into strength. A month after the pageant, on a Thursday afternoon, Edward received an unexpected email. It was from Helen. He hesitated before opening it, not knowing what to expect. The text was long, carefully written, vulnerable. Helen began by apologizing, not in a generic way, but specifically and in detail. She acknowledged exactly what she had done wrong, the impact her actions had on Alice, and took full responsibility without trying to make excuses. Then, she briefly explained the process she was going through, the therapy, the support groups, the attempt to reconnect with the person she was before she lost her way. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, expecting Edward to grant it. She said she understood, if he could never do that. She was asking for forgiveness because she needed to say those words, because they were true, because they were part of her healing. Edward read the email 3 times. His first reaction was anger. How dare this woman contact him after what she had done? But then he took a deep breath, let the initial emotion pass, and tried to read it again more calmly. And this time he saw something different. He saw a broken person trying to rebuild herself. He saw sincerity, vulnerability, a genuine effort to change. He didn't reply immediately. He spent a few days thinking, talking about it with Miss Lucy, even trying to explain it to Alice in a way she could understand. The girl, with the simple wisdom of childhood, said something that surprised him. "If Mrs. Miller is sad, you can tell her I'm not mad anymore. I can be a little mad, but not forever. It hurts too much." It was then that Edward decided to reply. He wrote a short email. He thanked Helen for her message. He said he appreciated her courage in admitting her mistakes, that he hoped she would find her way back to education, but this time as the teacher she was meant to be. And he ended with a sentence that surprised even himself. "We all deserve a second chance. What we do with it is what defines our character." When Helen read the reply, sitting in her still quiet but now less oppressive apartment, she cried. They were not tears of self-pity, but of relief, of gratitude, of a tentative beginning of forgiving herself. She knew the road ahead would be long, that she might never be able to teach again, that she would have to find another way to contribute. But for the first time in a long time, she felt there was a possible future. There was light at the end of the tunnel she herself had dug. 3 months had passed since that December pageant that had changed so many lives. March had arrived, bringing with it the start of a new school year, and Northwood Elementary School seemed like a completely different place than it had been before. The changes were not just superficial, not limited to a new coat of paint on the walls or new equipment in the computer lab. Although those improvements had also happened, the deepest changes were invisible to the eye but palpable in the air, in the way people related to each other, in the respect that permeated every interaction. The Code of Conduct was finally approved at a General Assembly at the end of February, an event that brought together more than 200 people, including parents, teachers, staff, and community members. The document, with its 23 carefully crafted pages, established clear guidelines on the rights and responsibilities of everyone, protocols for handling conflicts, protected reporting channels, and most importantly, an explicit commitment to the dignity of every child regardless of their background, appearance, or any other characteristic. Marilyn, who had led the process alongside the Parent Association, cried on the day of its approval. She saw in that document much more than words on paper. She saw the result of months of collective work, of heated but respectful discussions, of truly democratic construction, and above all, she saw proof that trauma can be transformed into transformation when the right people come together for the right reason. The implementation of the code brought immediate practical changes. All teachers, including the new hires for the school year, underwent a mandatory 40-hour training on its principles. It wasn't just theory. There were simulations of real situations, case discussions, empathy exercises. Some older teachers resisted at first, feeling their decades-old practices were being questioned. But gradually, even the most skeptical began to see that it wasn't about oversight or punishment, but about support and improvement. Carla, the teacher who had been Helen's colleague, became one of the biggest advocates for the new practices. She coordinated a weekly study group where teachers shared challenges and solutions, creating a network of mutual support. In one of the meetings, Carla shared her own journey. "I confess that before what happened, I also had my moments of being too harsh, of judging too quickly. I saw in Helen a mirror of what I could become if I didn't change, and that scared me. But it also motivated me. Today, I strive every day to see each student as a whole human being, not just a student who needs to learn content." Carla's words resonated deeply with other teachers. Many began to share their own stories, their own failings, creating an environment of vulnerability and collective growth that was rare in the traditional education system. Alice returned to school in February for the first grade. Edward was there on the first day, watching discreetly from a distance as his daughter entered the new classroom with her new classmates. He noticed something different about her. Alice walked with more confidence, her head held high, a natural smile on her face. The shyness that had characterized her movements before was gone. The girl greeted her new teacher, Ms. Bailey, a young woman with kind eyes who knelt down to be at each child's level as she welcomed them. Ms. Bailey knew Alice's story. Everyone at the school did. But she had made a point of telling Edward, in a meeting before the school year began, that she would not treat Alice as a victim or as privileged. She will just be Alice, a wonderful child who deserves to be seen, heard, and respected like all the others. And if at any point I fail in that, I hope you will correct me, because that's how we grow. Edward had left that meeting with tears in his eyes, grateful to know his daughter was in good hands. But perhaps the most surprising change was not at the school, but miles away in a small community center on the other side of the city. There, in a modest room with plastic chairs arranged in a circle, Helen facilitated a support group for educators in crisis. They were teachers who, like her, had lost their way at some point, who were struggling with burnout, frustration, or even behaviors they recognized as harmful, but didn't know how to change. Helen's journey to that point had been long and painful. After her official leave, she went through a disciplinary process that resulted in her early retirement. There was no formal dismissal, but the message was clear. Her career as a classroom teacher was over. Initially, Helen experienced this as an absolute defeat, a final sentence on a wasted life. But with time and a lot of internal work, she began to see it differently. Therapy helped her understand that her worth as a person was not tied to her professional success, that mistakes did not define her entirety, that redemption was possible even when the consequences were permanent. She started volunteering, first in community libraries, then helping adults learn to read. And it was in this context that she met other educators dealing with similar issues. The idea for the support group emerged organically. Helen realized there was a huge need for spaces where teachers could talk openly about their struggles without fear of judgment or professional repercussions, where they could admit they had yelled at a student and regretted it, that they felt overwhelmed and had acted inappropriately, that they were losing their passion for education and didn't know how to get it back. The group started small, with just 4 people on a Monday afternoon, but it grew quickly through word of mouth. Teachers came from different schools, different neighborhoods, some even from other cities. They sat in those plastic chairs and for the first time in a long time allowed themselves to be vulnerable. And Helen, who had once been the most rigid and least empathetic teacher at her school, proved to be a surprisingly effective facilitator, perhaps because she deeply understood the pain of failing, of disappointing oneself, of having to rebuild one's own identity from the rubble. In one of the sessions, a young gym teacher shared that he had prevented a student from participating in a competition because the boy didn't have the proper uniform. "I was so focused on how our team would be perceived," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "that I didn't think about what that would do to the kid. He had trained so hard, and I took away his chance to shine because of a uniform. Now I look back, and I feel horrible." Helen listened, and when the teacher finished, she spoke. "I understand exactly what you're feeling, because I did something similar, only worse, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. But you know what I've learned? That carrying it doesn't mean stagnating. You can carry that memory, that regret, and still move forward. You can use it as fuel to do things differently from now on. We can't change what we've already done, but we can change what we will do." Helen's words, coming from someone who had experienced the consequences of her actions firsthand, carried a weight that academic theory never could. The group became a space of genuine healing, not just for the participants, but for Helen herself. Back at Northwood Elementary, the effects of the transformation continued to spread in unexpected ways. Alice's story had reached other schools in the region, inspiring conversations about discriminatory practices that were previously normalized. Several institutions began to review their own codes, promote training, and create channels for students to be heard. Edward, who initially only wanted to protect his daughter, found himself inadvertently at the center of a larger movement. He began to receive invitations to speak at educational events, to participate in advisory boards, to support similar initiatives in other schools. He accepted some, declined others, always trying to maintain a balance between contributing to the change and not becoming a centralizing figure that overshadowed the true collective work. At one of these talks, at a state school on the other side of the city, Edward shared something he had been reflecting on since the pageant. "Many people ask me if I regret the way I publicly exposed the situation," he said, looking at the audience of teachers and administrators. "If I shouldn't have resolved it discreetly behind the scenes, and my answer is always the same. Private injustice requires public denunciation, not because I want to shame anyone, but because it's only when things come to light that we truly change. As long as we keep these situations in the shadows, protecting reputations at the expense of children, we will continue to repeat the same mistakes." The words sparked debate, as they always did. Some agreed completely. Others argued that there are more diplomatic ways to handle conflicts. But everyone left thinking, questioning their own practices, and that for Edward was enough. In April, the school organized a celebration to mark the new beginning. It wasn't an extravagant party, but a simple event in the yard, with performances by the children, food shared by the parents, and most importantly, a symbolic tree-planting ceremony. Marilyn explained emotionally that the tree represented the growth they were all experiencing together. "We started small," she said, "vulnerable, in need of care, but with strong roots and proper nourishment we grow. We become shelter, shade, life." Alice was chosen, along with 2 other children, to help plant the sapling. Edward watched from a distance next to Miss Lucy, who was also crying discreetly. Seeing his daughter there, actively participating, smiling, interacting with her classmates without fear, was the greatest proof that the pain of that distant December was being transformed into something beautiful. After the ceremony, when most people had gone home, Edward stayed for a while alone in the yard, looking at the newly planted sapling. He thought about everything that had happened. He thought about Helen, whom he had never seen in person again, but about whom he occasionally heard news through Marilyn. He thought about the parents who had mobilized, the teachers who had changed, the children who were growing up in a better environment. He thought about how a single moment of courage, even if imperfect, can trigger waves of transformation impossible to predict. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Alice, who already knew how to use her nanny's phone to send voice notes to her father. The childish voice echoed, "Daddy, did you see me plant the tree? I did it just like the teacher taught me. And you know what I wished for? I wished for all the kids at school to be happy. All of them, with no one left out." Edward had to sit down on a nearby bench, the tears finally falling freely. That girl, his Alice, who had been so hurt, was wishing happiness for everyone. She held no grudge, harbored no resentment, only love. And in that moment, Edward understood that everything, absolutely everything, had been worth it. The months continued to pass. The school year progressed with its natural ups and downs, but always within a context of more respect, more listening, more humanity. Not everything was perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of friction, still much to improve, but the direction was right, and everyone knew it. At the end of the year, in a simple closing ceremony, Marilyn announced her retirement. She had dedicated 35 years to public education, and she felt it was time to pass the torch to new blood. But she wanted to leave with the certainty that she was leaving something solid behind. And looking at that school, at that mobilized community, at those children who now had a voice and a place, she knew that yes, she was leaving a legacy. Edward, who had been invited to speak at the ceremony, chose his words carefully. "When this all started," he said, "I just wanted to protect my daughter. It was a selfish desire in the best sense of the word. But what I learned on this journey is that there is no true individual protection without collective protection. My daughter is only truly safe when all children are safe, when there are systems that protect the dignity of everyone, not just those who have parents with a voice or resources. So thank you. Thank you for turning one child's pain into a catalyst for change for hundreds of others. Alice, now 6 years old, was sitting in the front row next to Miss Lucy. When her father finished speaking, she stood up and started clapping, her small hands making a noise disproportionate to her size. And soon the whole school was on its feet, applauding not just Edward but everything that community had built together. Somewhere in the city, Helen was watching the ceremony on a live stream the school had set up. She hadn't been invited in person, nor did she expect to be. But Marilyn, in a gesture of kindness, had sent her the link, saying she thought it was important for Helen to see what her failure had inadvertently helped to build. Not to gloat, but for her to understand that even our worst mistakes can, if processed properly, bear unexpected fruit. Helen watched it all with tears in her eyes. They were not just tears of sadness for what she had lost, but also of gratitude for what those people had created. She could never go back and undo what she had done to Alice. She would never get her career back as it was, but she could, and was, contributing in another way. Every teacher who went through her support group and left with tools to be better, every educator she helped to not repeat her mistakes, was her form of restitution. It didn't erase the past, but it built a slightly less painful future. And Alice? Alice was growing up. She was becoming a curious, empathetic, strong girl. The experience of the pageant would be marked in her memory, Edward knew that. But not as an open wound, but as a scar that tells a story of overcoming, a story of how a father's courage and a community's mobilization can turn injustice into justice, pain into healing, exclusion into belonging. A few years later, when Alice was older, Edward planned to tell her the whole story in details she couldn't yet fully comprehend. He would tell her about the difficult choices he made that day, about the internal debates, about the consequences that were not always positive. He would also tell her about Helen, about redemption, about how complex people make mistakes and sometimes find ways to heal. He wanted Alice to grow up understanding nuances, understanding that heroism is not perfection, that transformation is a process, that we all deserve compassion even when we fail. But for now, Alice was just a child who had planted a tree, who had wished happiness for everyone, who went to school every day without fear and came home with stories and smiles. And that for Edward was everything. It was the living proof that despite all the pain, all the struggle, all the winding path, love always finds a way to win. The school would continue to exist. It would continue to face challenges. It would continue to be a place of learning, of conflict, of growth. But now, with a more solid foundation, with a more united community, with the certainty that every child who passes through its gates matters, not in spite of their differences, but precisely because of them. And it all started at a Christmas pageant, in a moment of injustice that could have been just another forgotten statistic, but which became a turning point because someone had the courage to say, no, this is not right, and we are going to change it. The lights of the school went out that night, the families went home, life went on its natural course. But something fundamental had changed, something invisible but powerful. The certainty that change is possible, that together we are stronger, that every child, every single child, deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. And that the true spirit of special occasions is not in the clothes we wear, but in the humanity we choose to cultivate. Alice's story echoed beyond the borders of Charlotte. In the following months, reports in major North Carolina newspapers and even national news networks covered the case, turning it into an example of how community mobilization can bring about real change in the education system. But Edward always made a point of clarifying in every interview that the credit was not his. It belonged to all the parents who mobilized, the teachers who accepted change, and Principal Marilyn, who had the courage to face the problems head-on. A special report produced months later showed the contrast between the school before and after. It interviewed parents who told their own stories of discrimination their children had faced in previous years, which now finally had a space to be heard. It interviewed teachers who admitted, with admirable vulnerability, that they too had to unlearn harmful practices ingrained in their training. It even interviewed Carla, Helen's former colleague, who became a symbol of possible transformation within the teaching staff. Alice appeared briefly in the report, already 7 years old, an articulate and confident girl who explained with the profound simplicity of childhood what she had learned from it all. "I learned that everyone is important," she said, looking directly at the camera. "It doesn't matter if your clothes are fancy or simple. What matters is your heart. And I also learned that when something is unfair, we can change it. We don't just have to accept it. We can fight." Edward watched the report next to his daughter, his heart overflowing with pride. The little girl he had seen so small and hurt at the pageant now spoke with a wisdom that many adults take decades to develop. And he knew that part of that wisdom came precisely from that processed pain, transformed into learning. The tree planted in the schoolyard grew strong. It became a living symbol of the transformation, a place where children sat to read in the shade, where teachers held discussion circles, where the community gathered for important decisions. Marilyn, even in retirement, visited the school regularly and always spent a few minutes looking at that tree, remembering everything it represented. The code of conduct implemented at Northwood Elementary became a model. Other schools in the municipal district requested copies, adapted them to their realities and created their own versions. The Department of Education, initially hesitant, eventually embraced the initiative and turned the requirement for all municipal schools to have similar documents into public policy. It wasn't an overnight change. There was resistance. There were poorly executed implementations. There were schools that just went through the motions without understanding the spirit behind it. But the seed was planted. Edward continued his journey as a businessman, but now with an expanded purpose. He created a philanthropic fund focused on public education, not just donating financial resources, but investing in teacher training, in research on humanized pedagogical practices, and in projects that promoted equity in schools. He brought other business leaders from the region to get involved, showing that social responsibility was not just about building gyms or donating computers, but about investing in the cultural transformation of institutions. Alice, as she grew, showed a genuine interest in education. She told her father that when she grew up, she wanted to be a teacher. Edward smiled every time he heard this, thinking of the beautiful irony that the girl who had been so hurt by a teacher now dreamed of becoming one. But not just any teacher. A teacher who listened, who saw beyond appearances, who treated every child as unique and valuable. Perhaps that painful experience had planted an unexpected calling in Alice. Helen continued her quiet but important work with support groups for educators. She never sought the spotlight, never tried to promote herself. She did it because she felt she had to, because it was her form of restitution, because she genuinely wanted to prevent other teachers from making the same mistakes she had. Over time, she developed her own methodologies, wrote teaching materials on self-care for educators, on how to identify signs of burnout before they led to harmful behaviors. Ironically, Helen became an expert in something she had never imagined: how to deal with one's own failure constructively. She gave occasional lectures to groups of teachers, always starting with her story, with complete honesty about what she had done wrong. She didn't soften anything. She didn't play the victim. She just told the raw truth and then shared what she had learned in the process of trying to heal. Her lectures were always packed because they touched on something rarely discussed in the educational field: the imperfect humanity of educators. Once at one of these lectures, someone from the audience asked if she and Edward had ever met in person after the incident. Helen took a deep breath before answering. "No," she said, "and I don't think we should. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt. Some distances need to be respected. He forgave me in his own way, through generous words in an email. I apologized in my own way, by taking full responsibility, but we don't need to be friends. We don't need a performative reconciliation. Sometimes the healthiest way to move forward is to follow parallel paths, acknowledging what happened but not trying to force a closeness that isn't natural or necessary." The answer was profound in its honesty, And many in the audience, who were perhaps expecting a Hollywood ending with hugs and tears of mutual forgiveness, understood that real life doesn't work that way, that healing doesn't always mean friendship, that responsibility doesn't always result in complete absolution, and that's okay, that it's possible to live with consequences, learn from mistakes, and continue to be human despite our flaws. Ms. Lucy, always present in the lives of Alice and Edward, became a beloved figure throughout the school. Other parents knew her, greeted her, asked for advice on raising children. She actively participated in the Parent Association, contributing her wisdom from a long life of learning to value what's essential. In one meeting, when they were discussing how to better include low-income families in school activities, it was Lucy who remembered something fundamental. It's not just about money. It's about making these families feel welcome, about not making a face when their contribution is small, about understanding that participation isn't just financial. It's presence, it's affection, it's believing together. The years passed. Alice turned 9, then 10. She remained at the same school, which now had a sign at the entrance mentioning the awards it had received as a model institution for democratic management and inclusive practices. Other children studied there, each with their own stories, their own difficulties, their own beauties. And all of them, without exception, were treated with the dignity that Alice had once been denied, but had helped to win for future generations. Edward, watching his daughter grow up in that environment, knew he had made the right decision. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been without pain. But it had been right. And when Alice, at 10 years old, wrote an essay at school about what she wanted to be when she grew up, Edward cried when he read it. She had written about wanting to be a teacher, yes, but not just any teacher. She wanted to be the kind of teacher who sees every student, who doesn't judge by clothes, who understands that everyone has a story and deserves respect, who makes the classroom a place where no one is left out. And she ended by saying, "Because I know how it hurts to be left out, and I know how good it feels when someone brings you back in. I want to be that person for other children." Edward kept that essay like a treasure. It was proof that pain transformed into purpose is one of the most powerful forces in the world, that children, when properly supported, not only overcome traumas, but transform them into a life mission. The story of Alice, Edward, Helen, Marilyn, and that whole community didn't have a perfect, gift-wrapped ending. It had a real ending, with scars that ached on rainy days, with relationships that would never be fully restored, with regrets that would never completely disappear. But it also had genuine transformation, systemic change, redirected lives, protected children, and restored dignity. And maybe that's the kind of ending that matters most. Not the one that makes us feel good momentarily, but the one that inspires us to do things differently, to be better, to fight for justice, even when it's costly. The ending that reminds us that each of us has the power to change small pieces of the world when we have enough courage to act. Alice would grow up. She would become a teenager, then an adult. She would always carry with her that memory of December, of that pageant, of that father dressed as Santa Claus who got on a stage and changed everything. She would tell this story to her children one day, maybe to her students if she really became a teacher, and the story would continue to echo, generating more changes, more reflections, more courage in other people to not accept injustice, to not remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, to not choose convenience over human dignity, because in the end, that's what it's all about. Choices. Every day, choosing to see the other person, choosing dignity over appearance, choosing courage over comfort, choosing love over indifference. And that choice, multiplied by thousands of people in thousands of small and large situations, is what transforms the world. One day at a time, one child at a time, one pageant at a time. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Alice, Edward, and the entire community of Northwood Elementary has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, courage, and transformation, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most in this story. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, reminding us of the importance of empathy, justice, and unconditional love. We'll see you in the next episode.